but I give you Grant to talk about the last train to Galax. Mr. Grant.
Does everyone have a handout? There are handouts on the table if you need any more. This will be a kind of a follow along on the map. Ron, if you could, when I get to the first slide, these are old Kodachrome slides, if you could bring the lights down, please. Thank you, sir. It's been good to see everyone, but particularly my tech friends, Virginia Tech Rail Transportation Association. In the 70s and 80s, we got together, Brent, Bruce, John Garner. Frequent visitor was Bill Harmon, station agent over at Christiansburg. Worked the Galax line, what we called the Galax line, the North Carolina branch. And the assistant train master in Radford at that time found us and welcomed. Good to see you. Dwight Henry was his name. And he clued us in on the imminent demise of the North Carolina branch. So I felt compelled to record it, photograph it, before they took the track out, including the last 2 revenue runs, and so that's what we'll have a look at right now. What's on the handout is a kind of an overview of the history of the line. It started out, the big draw coming out of Pulaski going south. They were going to head eventually to North Carolina, but the big draw at that time in the early 1880s, this was the Norfolk and Western Railroad. They actually built this line, unlike the Durham line, the Winston-Salem line, the Abingdon branch. Norfolk and Western Railroad went into the iron region. There was iron all over the area, this end of the state. But right along the river, New River, below Pulaski, where Claytor Lake is now, and then up Cripple Creek was a particularly heavy band, productive vein of iron. They had also discovered lead in there in 1757. They were mining it by 1780 easily. And iron furnaces were all through there, but they were having to carry it out by wagon. They were shots, wagon loads of lead shot were apparently going to Baltimore. There was a market in Baltimore for this, and a wagon load would take months to get there and cost $100 in pre-railroad days. That was a lot of money. So the N&W had an incentive, a market already there for a mineral service to get mineral out of there. And what they found out, they had lead. The metals involved were lead, zinc, copper, although much of that had been mined out by the Civil War. Lead, zinc, copper, and iron, okay? But the initial push was to capture that lead, and so they came out of Pulaski on the Bristol line, came back east on the Bristol line to Dora Junction. At that time, it was called Cripple Creek Junction. And down to the lake, what would be the lake, down to the river, went up the New River to what would become Ivanhoe, and then out to Cripple Creek on your map there in red, okay? The Cripple Creek extension, that was a door at that time, would have been called Cripple Creek Junction. They got that working. That got them the revenue to bring things along, but there was thoughts of getting into more of the minerals that were south of there, and also to look into North Carolina as another option to the Roanoke and Southern and the Durham line. So they started out of Ivanhoe in 1888, forming another company called the New River Plateau Railroad, but in any event, they started the North Carolina extension from the Cripple Creek extension south towards Galax. And the whole idea of coming along the New, again, they're going to go up the New River. They were granted rights on the New River already by the New River Railroad that got them from Radford downriver to Glen Lynn. When they acquired the New River Railroad, what came with that charter was a clause with the state of Virginia that granted them access rights to the entire New River throughout the entire state of Virginia. Not North Carolina, but just Virginia, and that gave them the right of way in effect to head to Carolina. They reached from Ivanhoe, then they extended south. They also went down, there were two primary branch lines you see there in solid red, out to Cripple Creek and down to Betty Baker Mines on the little, what was that, the Reed Island Creek. Yeah, this was the Reed Island branch. Betty Baker, there was iron, but that's where they also still had copper. They were mining copper out of there at a relatively high yield for that time, and got started south out of Freeze, and didn't get to Freeze until after 1900, and then down into Chestnut Yard, where there was more iron, but they were also finding sulfur that they had found at Betty Baker Mines. And that started an acid plant operation by the Pulaski Mining Company in Pulaski, in addition to starting two furnaces there. So I show you Radford on this chronology map because that's where the runs, gives you an idea of perspective, but also where the runs eventually would start out from. But initially, up until 1954, according to Tommy Duncan yesterday, the runs on the Galax line came out of Pulaski up until 54, when the crews were then moved to Radford. Okay. They got to Chestnut Yard, and by that time the Roanoke and Southern was looking like it was going to be a done deal. They crossed the Blue Ridge at a much lower elevation. They didn't get up onto the New River Plateau, and then drop from what they proposed, as you see in the dashed red line, to Mount Airy. That line was to crest the Blue Ridge at 2,900 feet, okay? Mount Airy is about 1,100 feet. Exactly. The Roanoke and Southern didn't start to do any of that. Starkey was, you had to get up to Starkey and head down through Martinsville to get down to Winston-Salem. That line started out of Winston-Salem at the same time as the Durham line, essentially, and the same time as the North Carolina branch. There wasn't any way it was looking like Mount Airy was going to work because of nothing else. They had to be running the numbers in Roanoke. It was the sheer cost of the operation beyond the initial capital of building the line to cover that much elevation difference. The cost would just be prohibitive for a through line. But the line to Mount Airy was actually graded by the Cape Fear and Yadkin Valley, who would become the Southern eventually, that came into Mount Airy and dead ended there. They actually, and that's still working, they extended that line grade only. You can drive on parts of it up to the state line. From Galax, it extended down to the state line only by virtue of a survey, and most of it was deeded. So they bought right of way, but that was about the extent of it. And that's as far as it ever got. By 1909, some of the iron was starting to play out anyway, but about that time, the Minnesota started coming online, and a much higher quality grade of iron ore, and the iron business everywhere else pretty much started to tail off into the 19-teens. So sub-branches, I don't try to show all of the sub-branches, Allisonia, etc. They had sub-branches to various furnaces. All of this started to calm down, go away starting around 1909, 1910 into 1920. And so the iron business started to fade away. And so that by the time they got to Galax in 1904, the iron business was on its way. It was starting to look like it was on its way out. But the N&W had only built to Chestnut Yard and had stopped anyway because of the Roanoke Southern connection. There was no more incentive to go any further south to Galax, except that a local horse trader, Carosio maybe, he was a local horse trader. We would call him now a developer, an industrial developer. Oh, stop. I know. But listen, this guy did Galax a huge favor. He saw what was going on. He went to Winston-Salem and met up with a guy named Colonel Freeze. He was a textile manufacturer in Winston-Salem, convinced him to come to a spot on the New River that had a particularly localized, fairly high amount of fall in it that would give him plenty of power for what ended up being a textile mill. And that was the beginning of Washington Mills and Freeze. He convinced the railroad to move down into a little community called, what would be called Blair. The post office name there, though, was Ethel Phelps. I don't know exactly why. There's a family connection there, though. But Blair was the first wide spot in the road after Chestnut Yard, and where you could locate industry, customers for a railroad terminus. And so the N&W said, fine, we'll build there, we're good there. But it soon got overrun by business, in part because of this developer. And he went back to the N&W and said, listen, there's even bigger area, 2-3 miles an hour, and came to Billsby to get it. In operations, Dora Junction, by that time had become North Carolina Junction, and they were running 2 trains a day, 2 freight trains a day, a short run and a long run. The short run to Ivanhoe, the long run to Galax. There were a 60-foot table at each location. They were using G1s exclusively down to Silvetas on Reed Island Branch. They were using G1s in other areas, but mainly G1s because of the timber trestles. They were running into loading on the loading issues there with the trestles. W2s were the main power. They would double head them at times as required, usually to Galax, okay? By the 1930s, tonnage had increased enough. They had to look at more power for more tonnage to get passenger power went up to an E2 by that time.
576.
E1 or an E2, later the E2, E2A. Freight power was typically Zs when they could get away with it, Z1Bs, or the 2000s, Y3, Y3As, okay? Both the short run to Ivanhoe and the long run to Galax. At that point, they had to build up the bridges. The line got relayed twice. They went from 80 to 100 pounds in 1931 and then went to 130 in 1938. Virtually all of the bridges were rebuilt. What you see now mostly was rebuilt in 1931 to get away to up the loading. The Galax table, the Ivanhoe table, they didn't deal with that. You backed in, the articulated would run in reverse on the head end to Ivanhoe and then just pull back out to head home. To get to Galax, they took out that table and replaced it with a Y so they could turn the locomotive there. The tail on the Y was long enough they could also turn the 3-car passenger train, sometimes 4. But my understanding is, and I think Tommy Duncan backed this up, is that they eventually did, in fact I know of, because Bill Harmon said when he rode in there, they just cut the engine off, turned it. They did not try to turn the passenger train by the 1940s. but they put a Y in there to turn the locomotives in Galax. The last passenger run was in 51, and they dieselized in 57. By that time, Tommy Duncan says they moved the crew base in 54 to Radford. They were still making 2 runs, but eventually that got to 1 run, 5 days a week, and that would have gotten cut off in 81 when there was a huge zinc mine in Austinville, closed in 81. So they would have gone from 1 run a day to 1 run on Wednesdays. And I think we talked about that Thursday night, Kevin and David, that they were running a local out of Radford and a local out of Bristol 5 days a week, but every Wednesday they would meet at some point somewhere around Marion or Pulaski. But on Wednesdays, the Bristol local went down the Abingdon line, and the Radford local went down the Galax line. Ron, if you can get the. So what I'm going to show you are basically the last 2, mostly the last, revenue run, middle of October of 1985. So we're in Radford Yard. 2 cabs. They were going to have company, extras riding it, passengers. But that was the last shot for the last run. When they get to, so we've come this Dora Junction. So Pulaski's off to the right. Radford's behind me. This man's coming off of the Galax line. It became Dora Junction shortly after, not long after it was called the North Carolina Junction, named after Dora Furnace on this end of Pulaski. Dora Mills was the daughter of George Mills, co-founder of Dora Furnace. His partner was a local boy born in Hillsville named George Clark. George Clark would go on to be the principal involved in the Virginia and Southwestern out of Bristol, north and south out of Bristol, and eventually the clinch field.
I'm sorry, that was George Carter.
George Carter, thank you, George Carter. Thinking Clark as in, yeah. Thank you, Alex. George Carter. There was a Carter, Virginia on the Galax line. He was a clerk for an iron mining company, and he met up with George Mills, who was a Union soldier at Cloyd's Mountain. He was a foundry, his family was into iron foundry business in Pennsylvania, and he became an N&W contractor. So he had connections with the railroad. Mr. Carter had connections with the railroad through his clerking with this company, and they together started Dora. Mr. Carter, George Carter, went to New York, got some New York money, and eventually pulled together several furnaces, a grist mill, some foundries, all formed the Virginia Iron, Coal and Co. Does that sound right? Virginia Iron, Coal and Co. And Dora was George Mills' daughter. They named it after her, but that's how, but the Dora furnace would have been just off frame right. You come out of this curve to the right, there's a tangent that runs right down through the middle of Pulaski. This is the milepost. So you can follow by the milepost. This is near McAdams. The mileposts are of course numbered out of Pulaski, even though the branch line came off the Bristol line about 2 miles east of Pulaski. So one of the few tall deck girder trestles on the line near McAdams. He's climbing upgrade to get around the end of Draper Mountain. We're going here as soon as I'm done here, I promise. We'll try to keep this moving. This is Draper. Downtown Draper, what we're going to do, we're eating go up this road right here, we're eating back up, is that correct? Downtown Draper. So we're gonna, looking back towards Dora Junction, I'm at about the location of the station. I believe, this, hello.
Bike pit.
Oh, here we are, sorry.
Hang on. I'm not sure what you did. Hang on.
When they get messed up, it always shows up.
Yeah, I know. Apologies.
For you.
I think this house is still here. But this area has changed tremendously. We'll see it this afternoon. That's downtown Dory. You're dropping down from Draper Mountain, down to the river. Draper Mountain's off to the right. The New River has pooled here at the head of Clater Lake. Clater Dam went in 1939 at Hiwassee down to Allisonia. So we're running along the river, Allisonia Depot here. Hiwassee had a pigment plant that Bedford Iron later, Bedford Iron started in 1927. They moved their headquarters and operations from Bedford to Hiwassee. They got into the iron powder business, specifically pigment and iron oxide powder, with a sister company called Magnox that had a plant in Pulaski. But the pigment plant, so these are color pigments for paint, was located in Hiwassee in a huge plant, 5 large buildings. It was a massive operation. And they would haul out of there all manner of iron oxide. Yes, Kevin?
It was a huge, long lead spur, and we set a car paint off down there.
Yeah.
But it was a long spur to get to that plant.
Yeah. You'd have to go back down the river towards
Yes.
the lake, right? Yeah. Yeah, sort of around the corner. It's still there, but it's not operating. It got acquired again. Hoover Color bought it. I do know Hoover Color. Pigments were used in ink, for example, for animated films. Most notably, the earth colors from that plant were used in the animated film Snow White. They sold out ultimately to a company that bought a competitor as well in Augusta, Georgia, and they moved the whole operation to Augusta, Georgia, and shut down Hiwassee 1 year ago, in June of 2024.
They made pigments for Crayola crayons.
Crayola crayons, yeah.
All the
Virtually,
Crayola crayons had pigment.
virtually anything that had color built into the product that would come in a mix, they were using the iron oxides as a color. So this is the second to the last run. You'll see those gonds. These gonds, we'll see them later with cross ties in them, but he's pulling out of Allisonia, headed upriver for Ivanhoe. Down Reed Island Creek, the Reed Island branch, the highway is on it. This was the section foreman's house, Bruce. Yeah.
Sounds right.
Yeah. Where's the station though? We never found.
I don't think we
This
ever
was
found
also called Boone. This was Boone Furnace. The town name was Cayula. This was taken out in '42, but Boone Furnace had their last blast in about 1906. The station was left dormant. The track was left in until '42 because they were still working local traffic south of this point down. Cut their station there up into 3 sections, loaded each section on a flat car, and rolled it out to Pulaski, down the Bristol line to Abingdon, up the Bristol line to the end of the line here at Elkland, North Carolina, and parked it here. It comes in from this direction. That's number 9, Chesapeake Western. This guy, that's either, quick, Jim, what's the spotting difference between a CH and a C2?
Between those two,
There's no number.
there's no spotting difference between them.
then that's either, and there was only 10 of one and 15 of the other, but that appears to be, and I do know that there are people maintaining databases of the old, I don't know what the history of this guy is, but that's an N&WHS or C2, and this is some foreign road. The cupola is too narrow front to back to be N&W, but it's Chesapeake Western number 9. So we're moving up the river, milepost 17. Here's an example of a stone furnace. The river's just off to my right here. I'm on the Route 100, Route 100 bridge. I can't find that on Google now. I don't know if that furnace is still in or not, but that was one example of some of the construction they used. And this is a lot of what the line looked like coming down New River there, coming up the river towards Ivanhoe. A lot of risk for falling rock. Quick and dirty. Probably get a good rate on an Airbnb here. Up to Foster Falls. Foster Falls was Newhoff Farms. I grew up with Valleydale hot dogs and bacon, right?
There you go.
Right? This is the spur. The station's behind me. 80-pound rail, transition joint, 130-pound rail. So you went from 80 to 100 to 130, okay? Foster Falls as it is now, so that previous shot was down just around the curve here. A spur came in front here. They did have order boards, but not that. I don't know where that came from, but they did have, everything was train orders, telegraphers everywhere, and Newhoff would take fertilizer and feed here. It was a huge cattle operation here. They were running a lot of cattle here, and a farm products. And this is now on New River Trail. That's been restored. Coming on down the line, Jackson's Ferry, where the shot tower is. This would be US 52. On the other side of that bridge, you can see the house here. He's coming upriver here, right at the shot tower there. Just down from there at 28. Austinville Tunnel, looking towards Austinville, up the branch. The other side of it, a tangent down through, all rock hewn. We got what appears to be, what should be, 2 different versions maybe of a telltale base. Coming into Austinville, the beginning of the siding at Austinville. It's a huge New Jersey zinc mining operation here. They discovered, as I said, lead here in 57, and then zinc. They were moving zinc out of here and taking it near Nashville, where I am, at a place called Clarksville, about on the L&N, to smelt it, refine it. But Austinville was the birthplace of Stephen Austin, the father of Texas, I guess, as in Austin, Texas.
Stephen F. Austin.
Is that right? Yeah. But they moved a lot of tonnage out of here. They moved a lot of tonnage out of here, apparently up to over 100 loads a day on that short run, using Y3s, 3As to get out of here. Milepost 30, we're now going to make the second crossing of New River on a deck truss headed towards Ivanhoe. This was also a 31 rebuild, but this was timber initially. It was a timber truss. Yeah. It's a big river. And then drifting towards Ivanhoe, this is following a long curve on the New River. I hiked down in here. This would have to be by the Redbud. This would be, what, the 3rd week in April, and found this. There was no track at Austinville, so I doubled back to, at Ivanhoe. I doubled back to Austinville, walked in, hiked into here, and found this was end of track as they were taking up the branch line later with that sled to pop the rail up off of the cross ties. They just lift the rail up on these pegs here, these posts. They put the rail heads up over those posts and then drag this with the locomotive and just pop the rail off as they were moving. We're down to Austinville. Austinville's a ghost town. Nothing there I could find. No track was left. As far as the railroad was concerned, this was downtown Austinville. There's nothing left. There's a large industrial site there with chain link fence topped with barbed wire. That wasn't looking very friendly. The most notable part of this was a rather impressive that lasted up until the end, this timber trestle. Going into a water gap here at Billsby, power dam here. It gets kind of tight with the New River in here. And we're down to Freeze Junction. Freeze is off to the right, continuing up the New River. To the left is Galax as it heads up the Chestnut Creek across this bridge. Chestnut Creek is here in its confluence with the New River. So this guy now is going to run up. They're going to run up the right bank of Chestnut Creek to head for Galax. I'm standing on the Freeze branch. So we'll make a Freeze branch. Now this is how much the scenery can change on this line. This is not far from Freeze. Look how much it opens up. We come into Freeze. Washington Mills was about it. There wasn't a whole lot of, and this wasn't working, Washington Mills wasn't working at this point. This was the second to the last run to Galax, but it was the last run to Freeze. And so they're backing in to Freeze. Right behind me is a Gone and Bruce Harper. Right here. He comes down, the mill was still standing at this time, as I recall. Is that right, Bruce? That's the end of the mill there. So the main track was here, into the mill, and it quit there. Dennis, did you tell me, or was it David, that said they were still bringing cotton in here in the late 70s?
Yeah, they were yeah, in 78, they still
loads
had,
of cotton to work at the work the mill.
So they were still receiving cars in 78 anyway.
Yeah. Well, they had the one Gone in here. You can see from the they were cutting the flangeway. It'd been a while. So he's got his Gone. He's on his way back out of town. But you can see the condition of the. It's been a while. But they had one lone car stranded in here. They were getting ready to tear the track out and they had to clean it out. We're going to go back to Freeze Junction and now start up the Galax branch into, this is Chestnut or Chestnut Creek Tunnel, looking towards Galax. Timber line on the portal, in part because of fall risk on that end. Not so much on the west end of the tunnel. It's all natural rock. Looking out the west tunnel, a telltale in virtually perfect condition. Hopefully never used. So we're looking here, looking back towards the tunnel so we can get some light on that telltale. It's hard to see the strands, but I mean, all the strands it was perfect, great condition. Another typical shot, but look how much the scenery can change along the river. This is again nearby, back on the river. Some very dramatic changes in scenery along this river. It's got to be a beautiful hike. Just very picturesque. Again, up Chestnut Creek, we're up at, oh boy, Gambia.
Right, Gambetta.
Gambetta. Sulfur, whole lot of sulfur was mined here in the Gambetta region. Chestnut Creek is off to the left, but this guy was wandering up Chestnut Creek. Now, Blair Furnace is just behind me. This was Blair. I'm standing where the station was. Blair boomed and then busted when Galax blew up. And so everybody moved from Blair to Galax, and Thomas Phelps came in here and bought up most of the town and built an estate here, Thomas Phelps of Baldwin Phelps Detective Agency, Bluefield. This is, I guess, became the home place. And but this was the proximity, the branch line there. This is just out of Blair. He's headed up up Chestnut Creek for Galax. And again, this is how much the scenery can change. What is this, a mile later? There was woods all around us. I could do a 360 here and it would look like that backdrop. But he was just there. And so, and then from here, it's another mile and here's Galax. Vaughn Furniture is just to my right. That's what this spur is. And then Vaughn down the Vaughn Bassett. He's going to come into town, cross, this is the main drag through town, and look at, no lights, just crossbucks. He really took it easy, blowing and what have you, down to the station here. It has to be the longest frame station I've ever seen on almost any railroad. This was Muncie Webb of the book, North Carolina branch, bought, I think he rented this end of it, but the railroad was still using the other end as a station up until 1984. So this is 85. So the last run pulls in here. People, they're going to collect some riders here. You can see where they were shipping livestock out of there. Galax Mirror was one of the largest mirror manufacturers in the country. They shipped virtually everywhere. And Carnation, evaporated milk. They were canning milk there. There was so much dairy farm activity around Galax. Carnation was also a big shipper. But furniture, both Vaughn's and Mr. Bassett all started local plants here. And in fact, it was a point of pride. The only two owners outside of Galax were the Carnation plant, which would later become PET, and Burlington Mills. Burlington Mills had a textile factory here. Everything else was, quote, locally owned. So he's starting back out. Here he's back at Gambetta with his 2 boxcars and 10 Gons, coming back into Austinville. Here's another, that's the whole track going off to the right there, down into the bottom where they were pulling the loads out of limestone or limestone bearing zinc or lead. They were still mining all of that here. The freight shack with the 2 doors in it was on the other side of the track, other side of the main before the whole track went in, and the passenger station was just behind that. It got moved across the tracks. And I don't recall if these guys were getting on or just watching it by. We're back at Allisonia at milepost 12. There's the Allisonia Depot. It has since been restored. It had already been moved off the right-of-way. There were 3 tracks here at one time. 4 mining companies, iron companies, had headquarters in Allisonia. Back to Hiawassee, so he's approaching the bridge. Back across the bridge at Hiawassee, up around Draper Mountain. We're back to Dora Junction. And as always, and Dwight Henry warned us of this, Dwight would always chase this train in a company truck with a radio because he said something went wrong in that run on every time. and you guys who know what I'm talking about, what does that tell you? He had to take the front end of his train. The branch line to Galax is to the right. Pulaski's down behind, over here to the left. And Radford is off to the left, up high. So he's cut his train already, the front end of the train, backed it down into Pulaski. He's come back and grabbed a bad order that involved a cable. That can't be good. And had to pull that one car out, run it back into Pulaski, set it off on the spur for the car shop to be able to get to it with a truck. He comes back up here. He'll back down into the branch, pick up. Oh, he'll pick the rest of his train up in Pulaski, pull it up the front end, back it back down into the, put his train back together, And they recruited Bruce and myself to flag that crossing. There was a crossing just to the right, and they were short-handed and in a hurry, and so we were flagging the crossing for them. We were the only two photographers there.
You can scale right.
Oh, I never saw, you know, I sent him an invoice, I never saw him. And so he puts his train back together. Notice the covered hoppers. From Austinville, he went back through Foster Falls at Newhoff, picked up 6 covered hoppers, empty covered hoppers. So those are on the head end, in addition to 2 boxcars and 10 guns. And now he's gotten a green board and lined out, headed back to Radford. And
2 cabs. That's
this
631.
this man on the left, this is Muncie Webb. I do not know, would anybody happen to know who the other 2 gentlemen are? One of them was a Newhoff that was riding back to Radford. But there's other men on the cab, and I assume this is the conductor. But I don't know that. But anyway, I know Mr. Webb. And so he's...
Maybe a 32.
Now, it was Wednesdays. As far as I know, I'm going to put this out there, it was October 16th. There are several mentions in Mr. Webb's book that the last day was October 15th on a Tuesday. As we discussed Thursday night here, it was every Wednesday. And Bruce and I are pretty clear on this. Both of the last runs were on a Wednesday. This would have been Wednesday, October 16 and not the 15th. I did find a Pulaski historical marker that said November 15 was the last run. However, they didn't say it was the last revenue run. They may have been referring to another run, except that, to abandon the line, except that the track came out in Galax in December 11th of '85. So we don't know, but in any event, I've got Hank Kinzel, Bradford Division Superintendent. I had a release from him, been renewed annually. That got me in on the line. He had some anecdotes. Everybody had something on the Galax line. His chief clerk was Bobby Craig. I mentioned Bill Harmon. He's a great storyteller. He was a good one. Dwight Henry, our train master, and Mr. Webb. I want to add to that Tommy Duncan. I spent way too much time with Mr. Duncan yesterday and confirmed a lot of what I was trying to cover here. Fortunately, I didn't have to come back in here and edit anything, but thank you very much.
Thank you.
In his quiet, gentlemanly, unassuming way,
Where's this going?
this is probably the greatest untapped source of Norfolk and Western history still walking.
Yes,
One other little thing I'll add about that too.
Lights over there, please. Somebody hit the lights.
The lights. After I think